My name is Dr. Elena Moretti. I am 51 years old, and I am a clinical psychologist specializing in childhood trauma recovery at the Institute for Child Psychology in Milan, Italy, where for 28 years I have helped hundreds of children and adolescents process experiences of abuse, neglect, and violence using evidence based therapeutic protocols that are internationally recognized for their effectiveness in treating post traumatic stress disorder in young patients. But what I am about to reveal publicly for the first time in this testimony is something so personally devastating and professionally compromising that I have kept it an absolute secret for 35 years because it fundamentally challenges everything I thought I understood about healing trauma, the nature of shame, and what it truly means to use your own wounds to help others heal. On September 28, 2006, exactly 2 weeks before the teenager Carlo Acutis died of fulminant leukemia, he appeared without an appointment at my private consultation office. And during a private session lasting exactly 37 minutes, he revealed with impossible precision details about sexual abuse I suffered at age 7 from my maternal uncle. Details I had never disclosed to any human being in my entire life. Not to therapists, not to my husband, not to my closest colleagues, not even to my own mother before she died. And more extraordinary still, Carlo told me with absolute certainty that I would not be able to fully help child victims of sexual abuse until I publicly acknowledged my own victimhood, which he prophesied would happen exactly on October 10th, 2020, the day of his beatification in Assisi, when I would be standing in front of television cameras as expert commentator and would spontaneously break down revealing my own childhood. Abuse live on national television exactly as he predicted 14 years before it occurred. I was born in Milan, Italy in 1973 to middle-class Italian Catholic family, attended prestigious schools, graduated with honors in clinical psychology from University of Milan, completed specialized training in childhood trauma treatment at Tavistock Clinic in London, and built highly respected career as expert in helping children recover from sexual abuse, domestic violence, and severe neglect, establishing therapeutic methodologies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals and adopted by treatment centers across Europe. My professional dedication to helping child abuse victims was deeply personal, though I never disclosed this connection publicly. When I was 7 years old in 1980, my maternal uncle Marco, who was 28 at the time and lived in an apartment above ours in our family building in Milan, sexually abused me repeatedly over a period of 6 months until my family moved to a different neighborhood and contact with him became less frequent. And abuse eventually stopped when I was 8 years old. I never told anyone about abuse, not because I did not understand it was wrong, but because my uncle had convinced me with sophisticated psychological manipulation that if I ever told anyone, my mother would die of heart attack from shock and shame, and it would be my fault for destroying our family with my terrible secret that needed to stay buried forever. Even after becoming psychologist specializing in helping children process exactly this type of trauma, I maintained complete separation between my professional expertise and my personal history, convincing myself that I had processed my own abuse sufficiently. Through years of private journaling, self-reflection, and intellectual understanding of trauma dynamics without ever actually doing formal therapy myself, or verbally disclosing abuse to another human being, which I now recognize as textbook example of incomplete trauma processing that I would never accept from my own patients. If you are watching this testimony from Italy or from any English-speaking country where there are people who work professionally with childhood trauma or who have survived abuse themselves, please write it in the comments right now along with your specific city, because I need to know exactly where this message is reaching, which I consider the most difficult and vulnerable responsibility I have ever assumed publicly. Admitting that for 35 years I lived exactly the contradiction. I warned my patients to avoid being trauma therapists who never fully processed her own trauma, hiding behind professional competence while carrying shame that prevented me from achieving complete healing that can only come through vulnerability of disclosure. What I experienced during extraordinary session with Carlo Acutis on September 28th, 2006, and especially what happened exactly 14 years later on October 10th, 2020, when his prophecy was fulfilled in front of millions of television viewers, was not simply validation of supernatural knowledge, but devastating confrontation with limits of psychological healing when it remains purely intellectual without vulnerable relational component of sharing your story with others who can receive it with compassion. This testimony contains verifiable details that confirm authenticity of Carlo's prophecy, including exact date and circumstances of my public disclosure documented on video recording of beatification coverage, my professional history documented in publications, and institutional records testimonies from colleagues who witnessed transformation in my therapeutic approach after publicly acknowledging my own abuse, and especially immediate measurable impact on child victims I was treating who suddenly felt permission to share their own stories more openly after their therapist modeled vulnerability by sharing hers. To fully understand depth of impact that encounter with Carlo Acutis had on my life, and especially why his prophecy about my eventual public disclosure took 14 years to be fulfilled, I need to explain first the specific nature of my childhood trauma and how professional distance I maintained between my expertise and my personal history was actually sophisticated defense mechanism preventing complete healing that I desperately needed but was terrified to pursue. My uncle, Marco, was my mother's younger brother, charming, socially successful architect who everyone in family adored, including me initially because he paid special attention to me, bringing me small gifts, teaching me to draw, taking me for walks in park near our building, which seemed like loving avuncular relationship until it became something horrifically different when I was 7 years old. Abuse began gradually with inappropriate touching during innocent activities like watching television or reading stories progressed to more explicit violations that occurred when my parents were at work and I was in his care for a few hours after school and was accompanied by sophisticated psychological grooming where he convinced me that what was happening between us was special secret that proved I was mature enough to handle adult experiences that other children my age could not understand. The most damaging aspect was not physical violation itself, though that was traumatic enough, but psychological manipulation, where he systematically convinced me that I was responsible for what was happening, that I had somehow invited or encouraged his attention, and that if I ever disclosed it, my mother, who had fragile health, would literally die from shock, making me responsible for destroying entire family with my terrible secret. This belief system that I was responsible for abuse and for protecting family from knowledge of it became so deeply embedded in my psyche that even decades later, after becoming expert in childhood sexual abuse, who knew intellectually that children are never responsible for adult perpetrators' actions, I still carried visceral shame and responsibility that prevented me from verbally disclosing my own abuse to another human being. Abuse stopped when I was 8 when my family moved to different neighborhood, reducing contact with my uncle to occasional family gatherings, where he continued to be charming, beloved family member while I developed sophisticated dissociative skills, allowing me to interact with him politely at family events, while internally feeling terror and disgust that I carefully hid from everyone around me. My uncle died of heart attack in 1995 when I was 22 years old and already in graduate school studying psychology with specific focus on childhood trauma. At his funeral, everyone spoke about what wonderful man he had been, how talented, how generous, how much he would be missed. And I stood silently maintaining mask of appropriate grief while internally feeling complex mixture of relief that he was dead and renewed guilt that I felt relief about death of family member that everyone else was genuinely mourning. It was September the 28th, 2006, Thursday afternoon when I had just finished particularly difficult session with 9-year-old girl who had been sexually abused by her stepfather and was struggling to verbally describe what had happened to her, experiencing same shame and fear of family consequences that I recognized immediately from my own childhood experience. Though, of course, I did not disclose this connection to her or to anyone else. My assistant Francesca informed me through intercom that woman in waiting room needed to speak urgently with me about her teenage son, who was terminally ill and had specifically asked to see me by name, saying it was matter of spiritual emergency that could not wait. I normally do not accept patients without scheduled appointments, especially during emotionally draining day like I was experiencing, but something about urgency of request made me decide to make exception. Tell her I can see her in 10 minutes, I responded, preparing myself mentally for encounter with new patient without imagining remotely that next session would transform completely my understanding of relationship between personal trauma and professional healing. Antonia Salzano entered elegant Italian woman approximately 43 years old, accompanied by her son, Carlo teenager of 15 years, with physical appearance that immediately concerned me professionally. Extremely pale thin, with deep circles under eyes that nevertheless maintained penetrating clarity that contrasted dramatically with obvious fragility of his body. Carlo wore completely casual contemporary clothing: gray Nike sneakers, dark blue worn jeans, blue hooded sweatshirt, and carried black backpack with laptop that he placed carefully on floor next to chair where he sat with slow, careful movements suggesting significant physical pain or extreme bodily weakness. Antonia began, explaining with voice broken by emotion she struggled to control. Dr. Moretti, I apologize for presenting without appointment, but my son Carlo specifically insisted he needed to speak with you today. 2 weeks ago, he was diagnosed with acute promyelocytic leukemia, very aggressive form of blood cancer. Doctors at San Gerardo Hospital have been honest with us. Prognosis is very grave. They give him few weeks, maybe only days of life. We have tried aggressive chemotherapy treatment, but his body is not responding, and cancer is advancing very rapidly. I felt immediately overwhelmed by maternal compassion toward Antonia, recognizing in her expression same anticipatory pain of imminent loss that I had witnessed in hundreds of parents of terminally ill children during my career, though I had never personally experienced loss of child myself, having chosen not to have children partly due to unresolved trauma from my own childhood that made me terrified of being responsible for another vulnerable human being. But Carlo insists, Antonia continued looking at her son with mixture of love and confusion, that he needs to speak with psychologist before it is too late. Not to process his own death because he seems to have extraordinary peace about that, but because he says he has something important to communicate specifically to you. I do not know what it is, but he was very insistent. Would it be possible for you to speak with him alone for a few minutes? Carlo intervened with soft but clear voice that had quality of maturity, not corresponding to 15-year-old teenager. Mom, can you wait in waiting room while I speak with Dr. Moretti? What I need to tell her is private. I promise it will not take much time. Antonia nodded with tears in eyes, left consultation office closing door, softly leaving me alone with Carlo, who observed me with intensity that made me feel simultaneously uncomfortable and intrigued. Carlo leaned forward in his chair with visible effort, resting elbows on knees and looking directly into my eyes with expression of compassion that seemed completely out of place, coming from terminally ill teenager speaking with adult professional, psychologist who supposedly should be one providing compassion to him. Dr. Moretti, Carlo began with calm but firm voice. I know that you specialize in helping children who have been sexually abused. I know that you have published 17 peer-reviewed articles on childhood sexual trauma treatment. I know that you are considered leading expert in Italy on this specific type of trauma. And I know something that no one else knows. You yourself were sexually abused by your uncle Marco when you were 7 and 8 years old, and you have never told this to anyone in your entire life, not even to your own therapist, because you never actually went to therapy yourself despite being therapist who insists all her patients must do therapy to heal. I felt floor moving beneath my feet. How could this dying teenager possibly know most closely guarded secret of my entire life? I had never written about it, never spoken about it, never even typed it into private journal on computer, for fear someone might somehow discover it. It existed only in my memory and in my uncle's memory, and he had been dead for 11 years. How do you know that? I whispered with trembling voice, feeling that foundations of my rational understanding of world were beginning to shake because there was no logical natural explanation for knowledge Carlo was demonstrating about most intimate aspects of my personal trauma. If you reach this specific point in testimony, it means God wants you to hear something about limits of intellectual healing when it remains separate from vulnerable disclosure. Please write in comments. I listen about vulnerability, so I know this message is reaching right people. Carlo breathed deeply before responding with voice combining gentleness with absolute seriousness. Because God showed me in prayer, Dr. Moretti. During last week, since I was diagnosed with leukemia, I have been experiencing moments of spiritual clarity where I see things about people I could not know naturally. And God showed me something very specific about you that I need to share, though it is most difficult conversation I have had in my life. He showed me, Carlo continued, that you became expert in childhood sexual abuse not randomly, but because you were trying to heal yourself indirectly by healing others. This is noble motivation, but it has fundamental limitation. You cannot fully help victims of shame based trauma until you yourself have experienced liberation that comes only through vulnerable disclosure of your own shame to others who can receive it with compassion. Every child you treat, Carlo explained with wisdom beyond his years, senses unconsciously that you are hiding something, that you are asking them to do vulnerability that you yourself have never done. They feel your professional distance, your clinical competence, but they do not feel your authentic vulnerability as fellow survivor who truly understands their shame because you have felt it and shared it and been received with compassion despite it. I began crying because Carlo was naming exactly core contradiction of my entire professional life. I had spent 28 years helping children heal from sexual abuse, using scientifically validated protocols, while never myself experiencing complete healing that can only come through relational vulnerability of sharing your story with others who can witness your pain and receive you with compassion despite your shame. But there is something more, Carlo said, reaching into his backpack to pull out small wooden cross that he had clearly made himself with simple tools, rough edges visible, showing it was handcrafted rather than commercially produced. God showed me very specific prophecy about when you will finally share your story publicly and how it will happen and what impact it will have. Carlo handed me wooden cross. This cross I made in my room last week using tools my father taught me to use. I want you to keep it with you always. In exactly 14 years from now on, October 10th, 2020, I will be beatified by Catholic Church in ceremony in Assisi. On that day, you will be invited by Italian national television RAI to provide expert commentary about my life and spirituality as psychologist who specializes in understanding adolescent development. During live broadcast, Carlo continued with absolute certainty, you will be standing in front of cameras speaking about how I maintained joy and faith despite terminal illness, and spontaneously, you will begin crying uncontrollably because something about my story will break through. Professional distance you have maintained for 35 years, and you will publicly disclose for first time on live national television that you yourself are survivor of childhood sexual abuse and that you became expert in this field because of your own unhealed trauma. The specificity of this prophecy was overwhelming. But Carlo, I protested, even if everything you say is true, why would I wait 14 years? Why would disclosure happen publicly on television rather than privately in therapy? Why would it be connected to your beatification, which you cannot possibly know will happen because church does not beatify people who just died, especially not teenagers? Carlo looked at me with deep sadness. Because Dr. Moretti, you are not ready now. If you tried to share your story now, you would intellectualize it, turn it into clinical case study, analyze it professionally without actually feeling vulnerable. Emotion of shame that needs to be witnessed and received with compassion by others. You need 14 years of continued work with child victims during which your defenses will slowly soften until day comes when you cannot maintain professional distance anymore and vulnerability breaks through spontaneously. And disclosure must be public, Carlo added, because God wants to use your story to give permission to thousands of other adult survivors watching on television who, like you, have kept their childhood abuse secret for decades, believing they are alone in their shame. When they see respected professional psychologist breaking down on live television, admitting she too is a survivor, they will feel permission to begin their own journey toward healing through disclosure. Carlo then revealed something even more extraordinary about nature of shame that keeps abuse survivors silent. Dr. Moretti, your uncle Marco told you when you were 7 that if you ever disclosed abuse, your mother would die of heart attack from shock. This lie has controlled your entire life, even though your mother died peacefully in 2003 of natural causes at age 68, proving his prediction was false. But you still carry visceral belief that disclosure equals death for someone you love. I was stunned. Carlo was describing exact fear mechanism that had kept me silent for 35 years with precision that revealed supernatural knowledge of my internal psychological processes. On October 10th, 2020, Carlo continued, when you spontaneously disclose your abuse on live television, your immediate fear will be that someone you love will die as consequence. Within 48 hours of broadcast, you will receive phone call that your elderly father had minor heart episode requiring hospitalization, and your first thought will be, "Oh God, I killed him by speaking my truth, just like Uncle Marco warned me." But, Carlo added with gentle smile, your father will recover completely within 1 week and will actually tell you that watching you speak with such courage gave him renewed will to live because he finally understood why you had always maintained emotional distance from family members, and he will apologize for not protecting you better as child, even though he had no way of knowing what was happening. This will begin healing of family relationship that has been damaged for decades by secret you carried alone. Carlo described with impossible detail exactly how disclosure would unfold. You will be standing in front of Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi holding microphone speaking to camera about psychological aspects of my spirituality. Reporter will ask you what you think enabled me at 15 to face death with such peace and joy. You will begin answering professionally about adolescent identity development, spiritual maturity, psychological resilience. But then, Carlo said, you will see, in crowd of pilgrims, young girl approximately 8 years old, holding her mother's hand, looking at you with expression of hope and fear simultaneously. And that girl's face will trigger memory of yourself at age 7, and suddenly you will not be able to maintain professional distance anymore, and you will begin crying, saying into microphone, I know what it is like to carry a terrible secret as child. I know what it is like to believe you are alone and dirty and responsible for something adult did to you. Because I was sexually abused by my uncle when I was 7 years old, and I became psychologist specializing in childhood trauma because I was trying to heal myself by healing others. The detail with which Carlo described future event was terrifying in its precision. After you say those words, Carlo continued, there will be moment of complete silence. Reporter will be frozen, not knowing how to respond. Camera operator will keep filming because he will recognize he is witnessing something extraordinary. And then your phone will begin ringing continuously as producers in studio try to reach you to ask if you want them to cut broadcast, but you will make decision in that moment to continue speaking to tell complete story of your abuse in your 35 years of silence. Within 24 hours of broadcast, Carlo prophesied, you will receive more than 800 messages from adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, most of them women between ages of 35 and 65, who have never disclosed their abuse to anyone and who say that watching you break down on television gave them first feeling of permission to consider sharing their own stories. 53 of them will specifically request to begin therapy with you, saying they need therapist who truly understands shame of keeping abuse secret for decades. Carlo described impact with specificity. Within 1 year of your disclosure, you will notice measurable change in therapeutic outcomes with child victims you treat. Children who previously took months to verbally describe abuse will begin sharing details in first or second session because they will sense unconsciously that you are no longer hiding something that you have done vulnerability you are asking them to do, and therefore it is safe for them to be vulnerable with you. Your clinical supervisor, Dr. Stefano Ricci, Carlo said. Naming my supervisor, whom I had never mentioned to anyone outside my professional circle, will comment during a supervision session in November 2020 that your therapeutic presence has fundamentally changed, that you seem more authentically present with patients, less clinically distant, more able to sit with their shame without reflexively trying to fix it immediately with cognitive interventions. And he will ask what shifted in your approach, and you will tell him about your disclosure on television and about this conversation we are having today. I was completely overwhelmed by specificity of Carlo's prophecy, which included names, dates, specific details that seemed impossible for dying teenager to know through natural means. But Carlo, I asked, if everything you are telling me is true and will happen exactly as you describe, what should I do during 14 years between now and my disclosure? Should I try to share my story privately before then? Should I prepare somehow? Carlo shook his head gently. No, Dr. Moretti. You will not be able to share your story before prophesied moment. You will try several times during next 14 years, especially after particularly difficult sessions with child victims where you feel overwhelming desire to tell them you understand from personal experience, but each time you try, words will literally stick in your throat, unable to be spoken, and you will retreat back into professional distance. You need those 14 years, Carlo explained, of continued clinical work with abuse survivors during which unconsciously you will be preparing for disclosure that you do not yet know is coming. Every child you help, every story you witness, every shame reaction you process clinically will be softening your defenses until day arrives when they finally break completely in front of television cameras. Carlo then gave me specific instruction about wooden cross he had made. Keep this cross in your office where you can see it every day. During next 14 years, when you look at it, remember this conversation, remember my prophecy, and know that your silence is temporary, that God has specific moment planned for your liberation, and that your story will help thousands of survivors who are waiting to hear it. There is one more thing, Carlo added with particular seriousness, that I need to tell you about nature of shame and healing. Shame cannot be healed in isolation, no matter how sophisticated your self-reflection or intellectual understanding. Shame is relational wound that can only be healed through relational medicine of being witnessed in your vulnerability by others who receive you with compassion, despite your deepest fear that if they truly knew you, they would reject you. This is why, Carlo explained, all your years of private journaling, all your intellectual understanding of trauma dynamics, all your professional expertise treating hundreds of child victims did not heal your own shame because shame requires vulnerable disclosure to another human being who can look at you with eyes of compassion and say, I see what happened to you, and it was not your fault, and you are not dirty, and I still love you and accept you completely. I understood intellectually what Carlo was saying because it was exactly what I taught in my trauma treatment seminars, but hearing it applied to my own situation with such penetrating accuracy was devastating because it meant I had spent 3 decades helping others achieve healing I had never allowed myself to experience. After your disclosure on television, Carlo prophesied, you will receive invitation from Survivors Organization in Rome to speak at conference about therapists who are themselves trauma survivors and importance of therapist vulnerability in healing process. You will accept invitation, and during that conference, you will meet woman named Julia Romano, who will become your closest friend and who will reveal that she too is survivor of childhood sexual abuse by family member and that she too kept it secret for 40 years until she heard your disclosure on television. The specificity with which Carlo described future was extraordinary. Julia will tell you, Carlo continued, that watching you break down on television was first time in her life she felt she was not alone, that there were other women like her, successful, professional, accomplished, who carried same secret shame, and that if you could find courage to speak after 35 years, maybe she could too after 40 years. You and Julia will begin meeting weekly for coffee, Carlo said, and these conversations will provide deeper healing for your trauma than all years of private intellectual processing because finally you will have someone who truly understands shame of keeping abuse secret for decades, someone with whom you can share details you have never shared with anyone, someone who receives your story with compassion, without judgment, without trying to fix you or rush your healing. Carlo stood up slowly, clearly exhausted by conversation, but with expression of peace on his face. Dr. Moretti, I will die on October 12th, 2006, exactly 14 days from today. I am not afraid of death because I know Jesus is waiting for me, and my life, though brief, had specific purpose God assigned me. Part of that purpose was coming here today to give you this prophecy and this wooden cross because God showed me that your silence about your own abuse is preventing complete healing. You need and preventing maximum therapeutic effectiveness with child victims who need your authentic vulnerability, not just your clinical expertise. He moved toward door but stopped, turning to look at me one last time. When you do finally disclose on October 10th, 2020, remember that it was not accident or breakdown or loss of professional control, but fulfillment of prophecy that dying teenager gave you 14 years earlier. Remember that God had specific moment planned for your liberation, and that your courage to speak will give permission to thousands of other survivors to begin their own journey toward healing through vulnerable disclosure. Carlo left my office, leaving me holding small wooden cross that weighed barely few grams physically, but felt like burden of prophesied future I would carry for 14 years before its meaning would be revealed publicly in front of millions of television viewers. Exactly as terminally ill teenager had predicted with supernatural precision. After Carlo left that day, I sat in my office for more than an hour holding wooden cross he had made trying to process what had just happened. Everything he said about my childhood abuse was true, despite impossibility of his knowing it through natural means. His description of psychological dynamics keeping me silent was more accurate than any clinical formulation I had written about my own case in private journals. But most disturbing was his prophecy about my disclosure happening publicly on television during his beatification 14 years in future. This seemed impossible for multiple reasons. Carlo was dying teenager, not officially recognized saint, so idea that Catholic Church would beatify him within 14 years seemed unlikely. And even if it happened, why would I be invited to provide psychological commentary? And most importantly, how could he possibly know with such precision that I would break down crying and spontaneously disclose abuse I had kept secret for 3.5 decades? I placed wooden cross on my desk where it remained visible during every therapy session for next 14 years. Hundreds of child victims sat across from me in that office, looking at small handmade cross without knowing its significance, without knowing it represented prophecy about therapists' own unhealed trauma that would not be revealed until precisely prophesied moment. During days immediately following meeting with Carlo, I considered trying to share my abuse story privately to test whether disclosure was possible before prophesied date. I scheduled appointment with therapist colleague I trusted, thinking maybe I could finally verbalize what happened with my uncle. But when session arrived and therapist asked why I had requested consultation, I found I could not speak words. Literally could not produce sound. My throat constricted, my breathing became shallow, and I ended up telling therapist I was experiencing professional burnout and needed to discuss work-life balance, avoiding entirely disclosure I had intended. This happened 3 more times during first year after meeting Carlo. Each time I attempted to share abuse story with therapist, with close friend, with my husband, words literally stuck in throat, unable to be spoken. It was exactly as Carlo had predicted. I would not be able to disclose before prophesied moment, no matter how much I intellectually wanted to. 14 days after meeting with Carlo on October 12th, 2006, news reported death of Carlo Acutis, teenager of 15 years, who had died of fulminant leukemia in Milan after brief intense battle with aggressive cancer that did not respond to chemotherapy treatment. When I heard news, I felt profound grief mixed with eerie confirmation that first part of his prophecy had been fulfilled. He had died exactly 14 days after our meeting, precisely as he predicted. I attended his funeral service in Milan, standing in back of crowded church, observing how many people, especially young people, came to pay respects to teenager they described as joyful, faithful, passionate about God despite his suffering. I did not speak to anyone about our private conversation or about prophecy he had given me because it seemed too strange, too vulnerable to share. During months and years following Carlo's death, I continued my clinical work treating hundreds of child abuse victims, maintaining professional competence that earned me invitations to speak at conferences, to publish in prestigious journals, to train other therapists in trauma treatment methodologies I had developed. My career flourished even as personal healing remained incomplete. But something had shifted subtly after meeting with Carlo. I noticed I was more emotionally affected by my patients' stories, particularly by shame reactions when children described feeling dirty, responsible, believing no one would love them if they knew what happened. These reactions triggered visceral memories of my own childhood shame that I usually kept compartmentalized, separated from professional functioning, but now seemed to bleed through more frequently. My clinical supervisor, Dr. Stefano Ricci, commented during supervision in 2009 that I seemed less clinically distant, more emotionally present with patients, and asked what had changed in my approach. I told him partially truthful answer that I was trying to allow myself to feel more empathy rather than maintaining complete professional objectivity, but I did not tell him complete truth that I was unconsciously preparing for disclosure I did not yet know was coming. In 2015, 9 years after meeting with Carlo, I began hearing news that his cause for beatification was advancing through Vatican processes faster than typical cases. Witnesses were testifying to miracles attributed to his intercession, particularly healing of boy with severe pancreatic disorder in Brazil, whose recovery doctors could not explain medically. I remembered Carlo's prophecy about being beatified in 2020 and felt both excitement and terror that prophesied moment of my disclosure might actually be approaching. In 2018, I was contacted by documentary producer at RAI Italian National Television, asking if I would be interested in providing psychological commentary for special programs about Carlo Acutis if and when his beatification was officially announced. Producer explained they wanted expert who could speak about adolescent psychological development and how someone so young could achieve spiritual maturity typically associated with much older individuals. I agreed to participate, feeling strange sense that prophesied moment was approaching, though I still did not believe I would actually disclose my abuse publicly. That seemed too improbable, too vulnerable, too professionally risky for someone who had built entire career on maintaining appropriate therapeutic boundaries. In February 2020, Vatican announced that Carlo Acutis would be beatified on October 10th, 2020, in Assisi exactly 14 years after his death and exactly as he had prophesied during our meeting in 2006. When I heard announcement, I felt chills run through entire body because impossible prophecy of dying teenager was being fulfilled with precision that defied rational explanation. Rai contacted me again, confirming they wanted me in Assisi on October 10th to provide live commentary during the beatification ceremony. I agreed, still not fully believing that disclosure Carlo prophesied would actually occur, but feeling irresistible, pull toward participating in an event that would prove or disprove supernatural accuracy of his words. During months leading up to October 10th, I found myself thinking constantly about Carlo's prophecy. I reread journal entries I had written after our meeting in 2006, noting details he had provided. That I would be standing in front of Basilica of St. Francis, holding microphone that reporter would ask about psychological aspects of Carlo's ability to face death with peace. That I would see young girl in crowd that would trigger memory of myself and break through professional distance, causing spontaneous disclosure. Part of me wanted to prepare disclosure carefully write script, practice what I would say if moment arose, but something prevented me from doing this. I understood unconsciously that disclosure had to be spontaneous, unscripted, vulnerable breakdown rather than professionally managed statement in order to have impact Carlo described on other survivors watching. On October 9th, 2020, day before beatification, I traveled to Assisi and checked into small hotel near Basilica. That night, I could not sleep, thinking about next day, wondering whether I would actually break down as Carlo predicted, or whether his prophecy would prove false, and I would maintain professional composure throughout broadcast. I took wooden cross Carlo had given me 14 years earlier from my purse where I always carried it and held it while lying in hotel bed. I prayed something I rarely did. God, if Carlo really did hear from you about my disclosure tomorrow, please give me courage to allow it to happen. Please help me trust that speaking truth will not cause catastrophic consequences I have feared for 35 years. October 10th, 2020 dawned clear and beautiful in Assisi. Thousands of pilgrims gathered in front of Basilica of St. Francis for beatification ceremony that would officially recognize Carlo Acutis as blessed, declaring him worthy of veneration by Catholic faithful worldwide. I arrived at designated media area where RAI had set up cameras and microphones for live broadcasts that would reach millions of viewers across Italy and internationally. Producer briefed me on format. After beatification ceremony concluded, I would provide 10-minute commentary on psychological aspects of Carlo's spirituality, specifically how teenager could achieve spiritual maturity typically associated with adults. I nodded, feeling strange dissociation as if I was watching myself from distance, preparing to participate in an event that dying teenager had prophesied 14 years earlier, with details too specific to be coincidence. Ceremony proceeded with ancient rituals of Catholic Church, readings, prayers, hymns, formal declaration by Cardinal Angelo Becciu on behalf of Pope Francis that Carlo Acutis was henceforth to be known as Blessed Carlo, having lived life of heroic virtue worthy of veneration. I watched from media area, observing crowds of young people, especially teenagers, many wearing jeans and sneakers like Carlo had worn, many holding smartphones and tablets, finding it moving that Catholic saint for digital age was being recognized. After ceremony concluded, producer signaled it was time for my commentary segment. I was positioned in front of Basilica holding microphone exactly as Carlo had described, with camera operator filming and reporter standing beside me ready to conduct interview. I felt heart-racing hands trembling slightly but forced myself to maintain professional composure. Reporter began, "We are here with Dr. Elena Moretti, clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent development, who can help us understand psychological aspects of Blessed Carlo Acutis' spirituality. Dr. Moretti, what do you think enabled someone so young, only 15 years old, to face death with such extraordinary peace and even joy, as multiple witnesses have testified?" I began answering professionally as I had done hundreds of times in lectures and conferences. From psychological perspective, Carlo demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity that we call in professional literature post-formal operational thinking, where individual transcends concrete reasoning to achieve abstract understanding of existential questions. His ability to integrate awareness of mortality with joy of living suggests highly developed capacity for what we call positive reframing. But then something happened exactly as Carlo had prophesied. I saw in crowd young girl approximately 8 years old holding her mother's hand. Girl was looking directly at me with expression that combined hope and fear. Simultaneously expression I recognized instantly because I had seen it in mirror countless times during my own childhood when I was carrying terrible secret, believing I was alone and dirty, and no one could help me. Looking at that girl's face, something broke inside me. All professional distance, all clinical language, all carefully maintained boundaries suddenly crumbled, and I began crying uncontrollably on live television, unable to stop tears that had been held back for 35 years. Reporter looked alarmed, not knowing how to respond. "Dr. Moretti, are you okay?" "Should we cut to commercial break?" But I shook my head, continuing to cry while speaking into microphone words I had never planned to say. "I am sorry, I cannot maintain professional distance anymore, because truth is, I know from personal experience what it is like to carry terrible secret as child. I know what it is like to believe you are alone and dirty and responsible for something adult did to you, because I was sexually abused by my uncle when I was 7 years old, and I've never told anyone until this moment." There was moment of complete silence. Reporter was frozen, not knowing what to say. Camera operator kept filming, clearly recognizing he was witnessing something extraordinary. Producer in van was frantically trying to reach me through earpiece, asking if I wanted broadcast cut, but I could not hear her because I was completely focused on continuing to speak truth that had been locked inside for 3.5 decades. I became psychologist specializing in childhood sexual abuse. I continued with voice breaking because I was trying to heal myself by healing others. But what I have learned today, thinking about Carlo's courage to face death with vulnerability and trust, is that you cannot heal shame in isolation. You have to speak it out loud to others who can receive it with compassion. So I am speaking it now, hoping that maybe someone watching who has carried similar secret for years will feel permission to begin sharing their story too. After I finished speaking, there was brief confusion, as producer and reporter consulted trying to decide whether to continue broadcast or cut immediately. But then, reporter made courageous decision to follow my disclosure with simple, compassionate statement. "Thank you, Dr. Moretti, for your courage in sharing something so personal. I think your words will touch many people watching." Broadcast continued with other segments, but I was in complete daze, barely aware of what was happening around me. My phone began ringing continuously as producers tried to reach me, but I turned it off, needing silence to process what had just occurred. I had done exactly what Carlo prophesied 14 years earlier, disclosed my abuse spontaneously on live television during his beatification, breaking down crying, unable to maintain professional distance, triggered by seeing young girl in crowd. Within hours after broadcast, I began receiving messages from survivors. 53 within first 24 hours, then hundreds more. By end of week, I had received more than 800 messages from adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, exactly as Carlo had prophesied, most of them women between ages 35 and 65, who had never disclosed their abuse to anyone, and who said watching me break down on television gave them first feeling of permission to consider sharing their own stories. One woman wrote, I am 62 years old. I was molested by my grandfather when I was 6. I have never told my husband of 40 years. I have never told my children. I have carried this secret believing I was dirty and alone, and no one would understand. When I saw you respected professional psychologist crying on television, admitting you too are survivor, I felt for first time in 56 years that maybe I am not alone. Thank you for giving me permission to consider speaking my truth. Another wrote, I am therapist like you. I specialize in treating sexual assault survivors. No one knows that I myself am survivor of childhood abuse by uncle. Watching you disclose on television showed me that maybe I can heal myself by sharing my story, not just by helping others heal from theirs. You have given me courage I did not know I needed. 53 survivors specifically requested to begin therapy with me, saying they needed therapists who truly understood shame of keeping abuse secret for decades. I accepted as many as my schedule allowed, feeling that Carlo's prophecy was being fulfilled in multiple dimensions. Not only my own disclosure, but ripple effect of liberation for hundreds of other survivors who had been waiting for permission to speak. If you are watching this testimony as survivor of childhood sexual abuse, please write in comments, I am survivor, because this community needs to know you are not alone. Your story matters. Your healing matters. And this channel can be placed where survivors support each other. Within days of broadcast exactly as Carlo prophesied, I received phone call that my father had experienced minor heart episode and was hospitalized. My immediate visceral reaction was exactly what Carlo described. Oh God, I killed him by speaking my truth just like Uncle Marco warned me. Disclosure equals death for someone I love. But within a week, my father recovered completely, and when I visited him in hospital, he said something that fulfilled another detail of Carlo's prophecy. Elena, I watched your disclosure on television. I want you to know that I am so proud of your courage, and I want to apologize for not protecting you better as child. I had no idea what was happening with Marco. If I had known, I would have stopped it immediately. I am so sorry you carried this alone for so long. My father's response broke another layer of shame because I realized disclosure did not cause death or rejection I had feared, but instead created opportunity for family healing that had been impossible while secret remained buried. And if this channel has been answer for you, consider leaving super thanks. This financial help, however small it seems, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep, transformative content to more lives that need this word. But most extraordinary fulfillment of Carlo's prophecy occurred in November 2020, when I received invitation from Survivors Organization in Rome to speak at conference about therapists who are themselves trauma survivors, exactly as Carlo had predicted. I accepted invitation, and during conference, I met a woman named Julia Romano, who approached me during break between sessions. Julia was 58 years old, elegant, successful businesswoman who told me she had been watching Beatification broadcast on October 10th and had seen my disclosure. I need to tell you something, Julia said with tears in eyes, that I have never told anyone in 43 years. When I was 15, my older brother sexually assaulted me repeatedly over a period of 1 year. I have never disclosed this to anyone, not to therapists, not to my husband, not to my adult children. But watching you break down on television gave me first feeling in 43 years that maybe I am not alone, that maybe if you could find courage to speak after 35 years, maybe I could too. We began meeting weekly for coffee, and these conversations provided healing for my trauma that surpassed all previous years of private intellectual processing because finally I had someone who truly understood shame of keeping abuse secret for decades, someone with whom I could share details I had never shared with anyone, someone who received my story with compassion without judgment, without trying to fix me or rush my healing, exactly as Carlo had prophesied. During one of our coffee meetings in December 2020, I told Julia complete story of my encounter with Carlo in 2006, including his detailed prophecy about how and when my disclosure would occur. I showed her wooden cross Carlo had given me, which I still carried 14 years later. Julia listened in silence, and when I finished, She said something that gave me chills. Elena, Julia said slowly, I need to tell you something strange. 2 days before beatification on October 8th, I had vivid dream. In Dream Teenager with sneakers and backpack approached me and said, your healing is connected to psychologist who will speak truth on October 10th. You need to hear her words and you need to meet her and you need to become friends because God has planned your healing through her vulnerability. When I saw you on television 2 days later, Julia continued, I recognized immediately that you were a psychologist from my dream. That is why I came to conference in Rome, even though I do not usually attend such events, because I felt compelled to meet you to tell you my own story, to begin friendship that teenage boy in dream said it was part of God's plan for my healing. I was stunned. Carlo had not only prophesied my disclosure, but apparently had also prepared Julia through dream to be ready to respond to my vulnerability with her own creating friendship that would provide mutual healing neither of us could achieve alone. Over following months, Julia and I continued meeting, and our friendship deepened as we shared details of our respective traumas, finding comfort in no longer being alone with secrets we'd carried for decades. But something even more extraordinary began happening in my clinical work, exactly as Carlo had prophesied. Children I treated for sexual abuse began sharing details much more quickly than before, often in first or second session, rather than taking months to build sufficient trust. During supervision with Dr. Stefano Ricci in November 2020, he commented on measurable change in my therapeutic outcomes, asking what had shifted in my approach. Your therapeutic presence has fundamentally changed, Stefano said during supervision. You seem more authentically present with patients, less clinically distant, more able to sit with their shame without reflexively trying to fix it immediately with cognitive interventions. What has shifted? I told him complete story of my disclosure on television and about meeting with Carlo 14 years earlier, and prophecy he had given about exact circumstances of my eventual disclosure. Stefano listened quietly, and when I finished, he said, Elena, what you are describing is exactly what trauma literature calls wounded healer phenomenon, where therapists' own healed wounds become source of deepest therapeutic effectiveness. But keyword, Stefano emphasized, is healed wounds, not hidden wounds. For 35 years, you carried unhealed wound that unconsciously created barrier between you and your patients, no matter how clinically competent you were. Children sensed unconsciously that you were asking them to do vulnerability you had never done yourself. Now that you have disclosed your own abuse and allowed yourself to be witnessed in your shame, your therapeutic presence has transformed because you are no longer hiding, you are no longer maintaining distance, and children feel safe to be vulnerable with someone who has demonstrated vulnerability herself. This analysis confirmed exactly what Carlo had told me 14 years earlier, that I could not fully help victims of shame-based trauma until I myself experienced liberation that comes only through vulnerable disclosure to others who receive it with compassion. During year following my disclosure, I noticed multiple additional changes exactly as Carlo had prophesied. My relationship with patients deepened. My comfort with emotional intimacy rather than clinical distance increased. My ability to tolerate shame, affect without reflexive cognitive reframing improved significantly. All measurable therapeutic outcomes showed improvement, not because I learned new techniques, but because I myself became more healed through vulnerable disclosure. But there was one more element of Carlo's prophecy that remained to be fulfilled, and it occurred in October 2021, exactly 1 year after my disclosure. I received a letter from a woman named Christina Valenti who wrote that she had been patient of mine 13 years earlier when she was 9 years old after being sexually abused by her stepfather. Christina wrote, Dr. Moretti, you may not remember me, but I was your patient in 2008. I want you to know that therapy with you helped me survive very difficult childhood. But I also want to tell you something I have never told you. During our sessions, I always felt you were hiding something. I could not articulate what it was. I was 9 years old, but I sensed you were maintaining distance that prevented full connection. Last year, Christina continued, I saw your disclosure on television during Carlo Acutis' beatification, and everything made sense. I understood why you had maintained that distance. You were protecting yourself from vulnerability you were not ready to risk. But I want to thank you because even with that limitation, you still helped me tremendously. And now seeing you finally share your story gives me even deeper appreciation for work you do and courage it requires. Reading Christina's letter confirmed another layer of Carlo's prophetic insight. My patients had sensed unconsciously what I was hiding, even though I believed I was maintaining perfect professional boundaries. My disclosure had not only helped future patients, but had also provided retroactive healing context for past patients who could now understand therapeutic relationship in new light. In 2023, 3 years after my disclosure, Vatican announced that Carlo Acutis would be canonized as saint, recognizing second miracle attributed to his intercession, healing of university student in Florence from severe head trauma after bicycle accident. Canonization was scheduled for October 15th, 2023. I attended canonization ceremony in Rome, feeling profound gratitude for teenager who had given me prophecy that transformed my life. During ceremony, I reflected on how accurate his predictions had been. My disclosure occurred exactly on day of his beatification, exactly in circumstances he described exactly with impact. He prophesied both on other survivors and on my own therapeutic effectiveness. After canonization, I was invited to speak at international conference in Madrid about relationship between therapist vulnerability and therapeutic effectiveness using my own experience as case study. During presentation, I shared complete story of meeting with Carlo, his detailed prophecy, and how its fulfillment had transformed both my personal healing and my professional effectiveness. One psychologist in audience raised hand during question period. Dr. Moretti, from scientific perspective, how do you explain Carlo's apparent supernatural knowledge about details of your trauma and future circumstances of your disclosure? Do you believe he actually received information from God? Or do you think there might be naturalistic explanation? I considered question carefully before responding. From purely scientific perspective, I cannot explain how Carlo knew details about my childhood abuse that I'd never disclosed to anyone. I cannot explain how he predicted exact date and circumstances of my disclosure 14 years before it occurred. I cannot explain how he described impact on other survivors with precision that was verified by 800 messages I received after broadcast. What I can say, I continued, is that Carlo's prophecy and its fulfillment forced me to expand my understanding of healing beyond purely psychological frameworks. Shame is spiritual wound, not just psychological one. It attacks core of identity, telling us we are fundamentally unworthy of love and belonging. Scientific techniques can help process trauma cognitively, but ultimate healing requires relational vulnerability, being witnessed in shame by others who receive us with compassion despite our deepest fears. Carlo understood this, I concluded, with wisdom beyond his 15 years. Whether he received that understanding through mystical experience or through extraordinary intuition, I cannot definitively prove. What I know with certainty is that following his prophetic guidance transformed my life and enabled me to help hundreds of other survivors in ways I could not when I was hiding behind professional competence without personal vulnerability. After conference in Madrid, I returned to Milan feeling deep sense of peace about journey from hidden shame to vulnerable disclosure that Carlo had predicted and guided. But there was one more element I needed to share publicly about what Carlo had told me during our meeting in 2006 that I had not yet disclosed. During our session, Carlo had revealed something even more personal about his own experience of dying that he wanted me to eventually share with others, but only after I had completed my own healing journey through disclosure. He had said, Dr. Moretti, when you finally share your story publicly and experience liberation that comes through vulnerable disclosure, I want you to also share something I'm going to tell you now about dying, because it will help people understand death differently. Carlo had explained. Many people fear death because they believe it means end of consciousness, end of love, end of relationship with people they care about. But dying is not ending, it is transition to different form of relationship. When I die on October 12th, which is now only 12 days away, I will not cease to exist or cease to love people I care about, including you. I will simply exist differently and love differently through intercession, through spiritual presence, through ways that seem supernatural to people, still in physical bodies, but are completely natural from perspective of eternal life. Part of reason God is allowing me to see details about your trauma and your future, Carlo continued, is to demonstrate that death does not end relational capacity. After I die, I will continue to intercede for you. I will continue to be present spiritually during your 14 years of preparation for disclosure. And when you finally speak your truth on October 10th, 2020, breaking down in front of cameras, you need to know that I will be there spiritually supporting you, giving you courage. You need to speak, even though I died 14 years earlier. This is not metaphor, Carlo emphasized. It is spiritual reality that Catholic Church teaches about communion of saints. Those who die in Christ continue to be relationally present with living through prayer, through intercession, through spiritual connection that transcends physical death. When you eventually share my prophecy publicly, I want you to tell people that death is not ending of relationship, but transformation of relationship into form that is less visible, but potentially more powerful. At time, Carlo spoke these words in 2006. I listened politely, but did not fully believe him, because as psychologist, I understood death as biological cessation of brain function, ending all consciousness and relational capacity. But after experiencing fulfillment of his prophecy with precision that defied natural explanation, I could no longer maintain purely materialistic understanding of consciousness and relationship. During 14 years between Carlo's death and my disclosure, there were multiple occasions when I felt his spiritual presence, particularly during difficult therapy sessions, with severely traumatized children when I felt inadequate to help them. In those moments, I would look at wooden cross Carlo had given me and feel strange sense of support, as if someone was praying for me, giving me wisdom I did not possess naturally. Most powerful experience of Carlo's continued spiritual presence occurred night before my disclosure on October 9th, 2020. I was lying in hotel bed in Assisi, unable to sleep, anxious about next day, wondering whether I would actually disclose as prophesied or maintain professional composure. I held wooden cross and prayed, asking for courage. Suddenly, I felt overwhelming sense of peace wash over me, accompanied by clear internal voice that said, "Elena, you are not alone tomorrow. I am with you. Trust that speaking truth will not cause catastrophic consequences you fear, but will bring liberation you need and will help hundreds of others." This was not auditory hallucination. I do not have psychotic symptoms. It was spiritual experience of felt presence and internal communication that gave me peace I desperately needed in that moment. Next day, when I did break down on television and disclose my abuse, I was consciously aware, even in that vulnerable moment, that I was not alone, that Carlo was spiritually present, supporting me exactly as he had promised 14 years earlier. This awareness gave me courage to continue speaking, even when my voice was breaking and I was crying uncontrollably in front of millions of viewers. After my disclosure, when I received 800 messages from survivors and began experiencing transformation in therapeutic effectiveness, I understood that Carlo's intercession was continuing, that his death had not ended his capacity to help others, but had transformed it into different form through spiritual presence and prayer that was less visible, but remarkably powerful. In October 2022, during first anniversary of my disclosure, I returned to Assisi to pray at Carlo's tomb in Sanctuary of Spoliation. I knelt before his incorrupt body displayed in glass tomb and thanked him for prophecy that had transformed my life. I told him spiritually that fulfillment of his predictions had expanded my understanding not just of healing, but of relationship between living and dead. While praying, I felt prompted to make commitment. Carlo, I promise to share complete story of your prophecy, including details about your continued spiritual presence after death, because people need to understand that death does not end love or relationship, but transforms them into forms that transcend physical limitations. I will use my professional credibility as psychologist to testify that I have experienced spiritual realities that scientific materialism cannot adequately explain. This testimony is fulfillment of that commitment. I am sharing publicly for first time complete details of what Carlo told me in 2006, including his teachings about death as transformation rather than ending, and his promise of continued spiritual presence that I have experienced repeatedly over past 18 years since our meeting. From psychological perspective, I understand skepticism some people will feel about claims of supernatural prophecy and continued spiritual presence after death. I spent 35 years maintaining purely naturalistic framework for understanding human experience, reducing consciousness to brain processes and relationships to behavior patterns. But meeting with Carlo and fulfillment of his prophecy forced me to expand conceptual frameworks to include spiritual dimensions that science cannot measure, but that are nevertheless real in human experience. I am not saying everyone must believe in supernatural prophecy or spiritual presence of saints. I am simply testifying to my own experience, which includes verifiable fulfillment of detailed predictions made by dying teenager about circumstances of my disclosure 14 years before it occurred, and measurable transformation in therapeutic effectiveness after I followed his guidance to share my story vulnerably. Whether people attribute Carlo's knowledge to divine revelation, to extraordinary intuition, or to some other explanation I cannot control. What matters most is not explanation for how he knew, but impact of following his guidance. Hundreds of survivors found courage to speak their truth. My own healing deepened through vulnerable disclosure. My therapeutic effectiveness measurably improved, and I gained experiential understanding of spiritual realities that transcend materialistic reductions of human experience. During years since my disclosure, I have incorporated insights from Carlo's prophecy into training seminars I teach for you trauma therapists. I tell them, healing shame requires more than cognitive techniques, more than exposure therapy, more than narrative reconstruction. It requires vulnerable disclosure to others who receive you with compassion. It requires willingness to be witnessed in your deepest shame and to discover that you are still loved, still accepted, still worthy, despite what you most fear others knowing about you. And I tell them something more controversial. Healing may also require openness to spiritual dimensions of human experience that scientific psychology often dismisses. Not all therapists need to have religious faith, but all therapists need humility to recognize that some aspects of healing, particularly healing of shame, transcend purely psychological interventions and touch spiritual dimensions of human identity that materialism cannot adequately address. Carlo taught me this through his prophecy and its fulfillment. He showed me that there are forms of knowledge and presence that transcend natural explanation. That dying teenager could know intimate details about trauma I had never disclosed and could predict with precision circumstances that would occur 14 years after his death with accuracy that defies coincidence. Today, 6 years after my disclosure on television and 18 years after meeting with Carlo, I can honestly say that following his prophetic guidance was most transformative. Decision of my life, both personally and professionally. My shame about childhood abuse has not completely disappeared. I still occasionally feel triggered by certain situations, but it no longer controls my life because I have experienced liberation that comes through vulnerable disclosure and compassionate reception. My relationship with my father deepened significantly after disclosure. Before speaking publicly, we had maintained polite but emotionally distant relationship, largely because secret I carried created barrier I could not explain without revealing abuse. After disclosure, we began having honest conversations about our family history, about ways dysfunction was transmitted across generations, about his own regrets as parent, who did not protect me from uncle's abuse because he had no way of knowing it was occurring. My father died in January 2023 at age 82. During his final weeks, we had conversations I never imagined possible about love, forgiveness, healing, and his hope that my courage to speak truth had broken pattern of family secrets that had damaged multiple generations. His death was peaceful, and our relationship was complete because we had spent final years in authentic connection rather than polite distance. My therapeutic practice has been transformed in measurable ways since disclosure. Children I treat for sexual abuse trust me, more quickly share details more openly, respond to treatment more effectively because they sense unconsciously that I am no longer hiding, that I have done vulnerability I ask them to do. Therapists I supervise have commented on change in my clinical presence, describing it as more authentic, more emotionally attuned, less defensively professional. But most significant transformation has been in community of survivors that formed after my disclosure. Julia Romano and I co-founded support group in Milan for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse who kept their trauma secret for decades. Group meets monthly and has grown to include 37 regular members ranging in age from 35 to 72, all of whom said watching my disclosure gave them first permission to consider sharing their own stories. During group meetings, we practice exactly what Carlo taught me. Vulnerable disclosure received with compassion by others who understand shame from personal experience. We share details we have never told anyone. We cry together. We celebrate small victories, like telling spouse or adult child for first time. We support each other through difficult moments when old shame resurfaces. And we experience healing that comes not from cognitive techniques, but from relational medicine of being witnessed in vulnerability by community that receives us with compassion. Several group members have commented on irony that our healing comes through following guidance of teenage saint who died at 15. One woman said, "It is humbling that boy who lived such short life understood healing better than most professional therapists who have studied trauma for decades." Carlo grasped intuitively what psychology is only beginning to recognize. Shame cannot be healed. In isolation, it requires vulnerable relational disclosure. In October 2024, 4 years after my disclosure, I returned to Assisi for anniversary pilgrimage with 12 members of our survivors support group. We prayed together at Carlo's tomb, thanking him for prophecy that had catalyzed our collective healing. Several members shared testimonies of how watching my disclosure had given them courage to speak their own truths to begin their own healing journeys. One woman named Lucia told group, "Before seeing Dr. Moretti break down on television, I believed I was only survivor who kept abuse secret for 40 years. I thought something was wrong with me, that I could not just get over it and move on like I believed everyone else did." Seeing respected psychologist cry and admit she too kept secret for 35 years gave me first feeling in my life that maybe I was not alone. That disclosure changed my life. These testimonies confirmed final dimension of Carlo's prophecy, that my disclosure would give permission to hundreds of other survivors to speak their truths, creating ripple effect of liberation that continues expanding years after initial event. Carlo understood something profound about shame and healing. When one person finds courage to speak vulnerably about what they most fear disclosing, it creates permission structure for others carrying similar secrets to consider speaking theirs. This is exactly how healing of shame-based trauma spreads, not through individual therapy sessions conducted privately, but through public, vulnerable disclosure that normalizes experiences people believed were uniquely shameful, creating communal acknowledgement that breaks isolation that keeps shame alive. From professional perspective, this raises important questions about appropriate therapeutic boundaries. Traditional psychology emphasizes maintaining distance between therapists' personal life and clinical work. But Carlo's prophecy and its fulfillment demonstrated that strategic vulnerable disclosure by therapists can catalyze healing for patients in ways that purely professional distance cannot achieve. I am not suggesting all therapists should disclose their personal traumas publicly. That would be inappropriate and potentially harmful. What I am suggesting is that we need more nuanced understanding of therapeutic boundaries, recognizing that sometimes carefully considered therapist vulnerability can serve therapeutic purpose when done with wisdom and appropriate timing. Carlo knew exactly when timing was right for my disclosure. Not in 2006 when he first met me because I was not ready. Not during following years when I tried repeatedly to share privately, but words stuck in throat. But on October 10th, 2020, during his beatification, when my defenses finally broke, allowing spontaneous, authentic vulnerability that had maximum impact both on my own healing and on healing of hundreds of other survivors watching. This precision of timing suggests Carlo had supernatural wisdom about healing process understanding, exactly when disclosure would be most therapeutic for me and most helpful for others. This is why following his prophetic guidance, even when it seemed impossible or improbable, was wisest decision of my life. And if this channel has been answer for you, consider leaving super thanks. This financial help, however small it seems, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep transformative content to more lives that need this word. If you are watching this testimony as survivor of childhood sexual abuse, please know you are not alone. Your story matters. Your healing is possible. And sharing your truth with safe people who can receive it with compassion will bring liberation you may not believe possible right now. It took me 35 years to find courage to speak. Some survivors take 40 or 50 years. There is no correct timeline. What matters is eventual willingness to risk vulnerability with people who can witness your shame and receive you with compassion despite it. If you're a therapist working with trauma survivors, please consider how your own unhealed wounds might be creating invisible barriers in therapeutic relationships. You do not need to disclose publicly like I did, but you do need to pursue your own healing through whatever means are appropriate for you, whether therapy, spiritual direction, trusted friendships, or support groups, because you cannot guide patients toward healing you have not experienced yourself. If you are a family member or a friend of abuse survivor, please understand that disclosure is terrifying because shame convinces survivors that if you truly knew what happened, you would reject them or think less of them or blame them. Most powerful response you can offer is simple, compassionate statement. I see what happened to you, and it was not your fault, and I love you completely. Carlo Acutis understood all of this at age 15 with wisdom far beyond his years. He demonstrated through his own life and death that true healing comes through vulnerable love, that relationships transcend physical death, and that God works through human vulnerability to bring liberation to people trapped in shame that keeps them isolated. I am sharing this testimony 6 years after my disclosure and 18 years after meeting with Carlo because I believe his message about healing through vulnerability needs to reach wider audience. Too many people are living with secret shame, believing they are alone, believing disclosure would cause catastrophic consequences, believing they must maintain perfect image of having it all together. Carlo's prophecy proved that vulnerability is not weakness, but pathway to liberation. When I finally broke down crying on television, admitting I was abuse survivor, I expected professional consequences, damage to reputation, loss of credibility. Instead, I experienced opposite. Patients trusted me, more colleagues respected my authenticity. Survivors around world felt permission to speak their truths. This is paradox of vulnerability. What we most fear disclosing becomes source of deepest connection when received with compassion. Carlo understood this. He lived it through his own vulnerability about his illness, his fears, his faith struggles, and he prophesied that I would learn it through disclosure that terrified me for 35 years but ultimately became most healing thing I ever did. If this testimony touched your heart, please write in comments exactly what resonated most, because hearing your responses helps me understand how Carlo's message continues to impact people years after his death. And if you know trauma therapists or abuse survivors, please share this testimony directly because it might be exactly message about healing through vulnerability that God wants them to hear. Remember that Carlo Acutis was not distant historical figure, but young person who loved video games, wore sneakers, carried laptop, and faced terminal illness with remarkable courage and faith. His message about healing through vulnerability is not outdated religious teaching, but timeless wisdom about human relationships and what it really means to love others by allowing yourself to be fully known, including your wounds, your shame, your fears. Thank you for listening to my testimony. Thank you for holding space for vulnerable truth I shared. And thank you to Carlo Acutis, whose prophecy 14 years before its fulfillment gave me courage to finally speak truth that set me free and helped hundreds of other survivors begin their own journeys toward healing. Dr. Elena Moretti, clinical psychologist specializing in childhood trauma recovery, director of Survivors Support Center, Milan, Italy, December 10th, 2024.